Have you ever thought about what lurks beyond the walls of a stranger's home? You may think you've found a peaceful retreat, a place to relax and unwind. But what if, upon arrival, the house itself feels wrong? Imagine walking through a door, expecting nothing more than a comfortable place to sleep, but instead, you're greeted by something cold. Something you can't explain. A presence that should not be there. These are the terrifying true stories of those who stepped into an Airbnb, only to realize there are things in the dark that don't belong. But before we get started, here's something you should know. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They forget to subscribe. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button right now, so you never miss a creepy tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below, because the darkness is only just beginning, and the terror has much more to reveal. Now let's dive in. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, a quiet house nestled in the woods, far away from the noise and bustle of city life. A place to escape, to find peace in nature, to let the weight of everyday worries slip away. The listing promised just that, a cozy cottage with picturesque views, charming interiors, and serene surroundings. Everything seemed perfect. She booked the Airbnb with high hopes, eager for a much-needed break. What she didn't know, though, was that this house held secrets buried beneath its seemingly tranquil exterior. It wasn't the scenic views or the rustic charm that would stay with her long after she left. It was the terror she would find within the walls, hidden deep in the darkness of the basement, a place no one was ever meant to venture. After settling in, she was greeted by her host, a man who seemed perfectly friendly at first. He was polite, offered a tour of the house, and made small talk as they walked through the spacious rooms. But there was something off about him, a strange urgency in his voice whenever he mentioned certain areas of the house. He seemed to glance toward the basement more than once, a nervous flicker in his eyes whenever the conversation drifted too close to it. The way he spoke about the basement was almost rehearsed. It wasn't the typical, "Oh, just a storage space," or "It's where I keep some old things." No, this was different. He kept referring to it as off-limits, in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't the tone of someone worried about a messy room or forgotten clutter. It was the tone of someone hiding something, someone trying to make sure she didn't ask too many questions. "You'll want to avoid the basement," he said, with a little too much emphasis. "It's not very pleasant down there." At first, she chalked it up to a quirky host, maybe just a bit eccentric. But the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The basement seemed too important to him. And that nagging feeling, the one she tried to dismiss, grew stronger with every passing minute. Something wasn't adding up. What exactly was he trying to keep her from seeing? As night fell, the peaceful atmosphere of the house seemed to vanish. The soft hum of the crickets outside faded into the background as an unsettling stillness crept through the house. At first, she tried to brush it off, the creaking of floorboards above her, the occasional thud that echoed from below. Maybe it was the house settling, she thought. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the noises grew more distinct. Softer at first, almost inaudible, but then louder, more deliberate, like someone or something was moving around in the basement. It wasn't the wind or the house groaning in the night. These were footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps that seemed to echo from below, as if they were coming from somewhere deep within the earth itself. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers tighter around her shoulders, but the sound continued, growing closer, more insistent. A chill ran down her spine as she lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, listening to the rhythmic pacing coming from the basement. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize it. It had to be the plumbing, or maybe an old pipe expanding. But deep down, she knew better. The sounds were too precise, too deliberate. And then came the whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs, as if someone was speaking from the other side of the door. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, but they grew louder with each passing minute. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind carrying the sound from outside, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone, down there, just beyond the door. Her mind couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was going on. The noises, the footsteps, the whispers were impossible to ignore. She grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, heart pounding in her chest, and stood up. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run, but she couldn't. She had to know what was happening. The basement door loomed in front of her, its darkness swallowing the hallway. She crept toward it, each step feeling like an eternity. As she reached for the handle, her hand trembled, the flashlight shaking as it illuminated the door. Taking a deep breath, she slowly turned the knob and opened the door, the creaking sound echoing through the house like a warning. The basement was colder than she remembered, the air thick and damp. But it was the silence that unnerved her the most. The footsteps had stopped. The whispers were gone. But there, in the far corner of the room, sitting in the dark, was a figure. Not the host, not a guest, but a stranger, still motionless, as though waiting for her to notice. Its form was shrouded in darkness, but there was no mistaking the way its eyes glinted in the dim light, cold, hollow, and fixed directly on her. She froze. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stared at her, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. Her blood ran cold as she realized this wasn't just some random intruder. It was something else. Something that had been living in the house, hidden in the depths of the basement, for who knows how long. And now it had found her. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. The figure didn't move, but its hollow eyes never left her. She knew she had to act. She couldn't let herself be trapped in that basement with whatever this thing was. But before she could make a move, the figure lunged forward with a speed that should have been impossible for someone so still. The air shifted, the silence shattered by the sudden rush of movement. Her breath caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, her heart racing. But then, just as quickly, the figure stopped, its head snapping toward the top of the basement stairs. A new presence filled the room. Behind her, the host appeared, stepping down the stairs with an unsettling calmness. There was no panic in his eyes, no concern for her safety. In fact, there was something almost too calculated in his movements. As she turned to face him, her body still trembling in shock, he smiled, a cold, knowing smirk that sent chills up her spine. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said, his voice eerily soft. The truth hit her like a punch to the gut. The man standing before her wasn't just the host. He wasn't even a guest. He was a relative, someone who'd been living in the basement for years, hidden from sight, kept in the shadows. The figure in the corner wasn't just a stranger. It was a part of his twisted life. The host had known all along, and he'd been hiding the truth. She had unknowingly stumbled into a nightmare, into a family secret darker than she could have ever imagined. Before she could react, he stepped toward her, the air thick with a suffocating tension. But panic took over. She turned and bolted, her body moving on instinct. She ran up the stairs, her feet pounding against the wooden floor as her breath came in ragged gasps. She reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled out into the night air. The cold hit her like a wave, but it was nothing compared to the terror still clawing at her chest. She didn't stop running until she reached the nearest road, out of breath, her heart still racing in her chest. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to know if he was following her, or worse, if the figure from the basement had somehow found a way to escape as well. The night seemed to stretch on forever as she made her way to safety. But one thing was certain, she would never trust an Airbnb again. Never again would she risk walking into a stranger's house, not knowing the darkness that might be lurking just beneath the surface. For Mark and Lily, an Airbnb by the lake sounded like the perfect romantic getaway. After months of stressful work and hectic schedules, they longed for a break, somewhere quiet, secluded, where they could unwind and reconnect. The listing promised exactly that, a charming cabin nestled beside the water, with the gentle hum of nature to provide the perfect backdrop. As they arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the lake. It should have been the start of a peaceful retreat. But from the moment they stepped inside, a subtle unease began to settle in. The house was beautiful with its wooden beams and cozy fireplace, but something about the air felt heavy. The silence was too thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the kind that makes your skin crawl, as though something was quietly watching them. Lily tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to the unfamiliarity of a new place. Mark, however, couldn't ignore the unsettling thought creeping into his mind. Something wasn't right here. The walls seemed to close in as they unpacked, and every now and then, they both caught themselves glancing nervously at the windows, half expecting to see something, or someone, out in the gathering dusk. The first night was calm, almost too calm. The stillness of the house was unnerving, but they both convinced themselves it was just the quiet of nature surrounding them. They woke up to the soft chirping of birds, the scent of pine trees drifting in through the open window. For a moment, it felt like they had truly found a peaceful haven, away from everything. But the following day, strange things began to happen. It started small, almost like their minds were playing tricks on them. The door to the bedroom would swing open on its own, despite them being certain they had closed it tightly the night before. It wasn't the wind, they were certain of that. It happened multiple times. Then the lights began flickering, just for a few seconds, enough to make them pause and glance at each other with confusion. It was as though the house itself was alive, stirring in its own way, warning them that this place was far from normal. And then came the temperature change. It wasn't just a drop, it was as if the very air inside the cabin had shifted, turned colder. The warmth of the cabin began to feel like a distant memory, replaced by a biting chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Mark tried adjusting the thermostat, but it didn't help. The chill lingered, gnawing at their nerves, creeping up their spines. But the real terror didn't come from the house, it came from outside. As dusk fell, Lily stepped onto the porch, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. She gazed out at the lake, the water shimmering under the fading light. The serene stillness of the place, which had once felt inviting, now felt suffocating, oppressive. She took a few steps toward the water's edge, and that's when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow, standing still at the far side of the lake, just beyond the trees. It was too dark to make out any clear details, but it was there, no movement, no sound. Just a figure, standing like a statue, its gaze fixed on the cabin. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen, staring at the silhouette. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was probably just a person walking along the shore. But then she saw it move, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though it were gliding across the ground, inching closer. Her heart pounded, her body tensing in fear, as she stepped back toward the house, her eyes never leaving the figure by the lake. Something told her this wasn't someone simply enjoying the scenery. The figure by the lake appeared again, closer this time. The next morning, Mark and Lily tried to convince themselves it was just their imagination, a trick played by the fading light of dusk. But as they made their way toward the water, the weight of the silence around them grew unbearable. Neither of them dared speak of what they had seen the night before, but both could feel it, like an unspoken fear hanging in the air. When they reached the edge of the lake, the unmistakable feeling of dread hit them again. The figure was gone, but something else had replaced it, something far more tangible. There, in the sand by the water's edge, were strange markings. Symbols, carefully etched into the ground, lines and curves that twisted in ways they couldn't understand. The patterns were too deliberate to be the result of an animal, and far too intricate to have been made by the wind or natural forces. Lily crouched down, her heart racing as she traced one of the symbols with her finger. She couldn't explain it, but a part of her felt like the ground beneath her was alive, as if something buried deep within the earth was calling out to them. Mark stood frozen, his gaze drifting to the water. It was then that they both realized. The air had grown cold again, the temperature dropping in an instant, even though the sun was still high. The hairs on their necks stood on end as they both heard a faint sound, a low hum, like a chant, almost imperceptible. But it was there, just beyond the water's edge, vibrating through the earth beneath their feet. In a panic, Mark grabbed Lily's arm, urging her to head back to the cabin. They had to leave. They had to get out of there before whatever was happening swallowed them whole. But as they rushed back toward their car, the feeling of dread grew unbearable. The air had thickened, the house now looming over them like a dark sentinel, watching their every move. They reached the car, but when Mark tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The car sputtered, the engine turning over but refusing to start. His hands shook as he turned the key again, but the car remained dead. They were trapped. The house was too far to run to on foot, and there was no sign of anyone else around for miles. As the sky darkened and a storm began to roll in, the house creaked ominously, its old timbers groaning as though it were alive. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into near-total darkness. The wind howled through the trees, but in the distance there was another sound, a faint scraping like nails on wood. Slowly, Mark turned toward the lake. There, at the water's edge, the figure was no longer distant. It was closer now, so close it was almost at the cabin's doorstep. It was no longer a silhouette. It was a figure in the flesh. Its eyes, black and empty, locked onto them, and the air became thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and something rotten. Before they could react, the door to the cabin slammed shut with a deafening crash, as if something, or someone, was keeping them inside. When morning came, Mark and Lily found the lake empty. There was no shadow by the water, no trace of the figure that had haunted them all night. The sun was shining again, the storm gone, and the air felt normal. Too normal. The unease that had settled over them was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. But as they looked around the cabin, Everything seemed still, unnaturally still. They didn't stick around. They packed their bags in silence, each of them avoiding looking at the other, their minds still reeling from the events of the night. They left as quickly as they could, never speaking a word about what had happened, both too terrified to bring it up. Later, after they'd left and were miles away, they checked the Airbnb reviews, hoping to forget the nightmare they had just lived through. But when they read through the comments, their blood ran cold. There, buried in the reviews, was a chilling note. Be careful. The house is haunted by a restless spirit. The owner disappeared years ago, and some say they were never meant to leave. When Jen booked her Airbnb, it seemed perfect, a chic apartment in the heart of the city. The pictures online promised modern design, large windows with sweeping views of the skyline, and a space so immaculate it looked too good to be true. It was exactly the kind of place Jen needed for her weekend getaway. But when she arrived, she was struck by one odd detail. The door to one of the rooms was always locked, and no one had ever mentioned it. The rest of the apartment was bright and welcoming, but this one door, tucked at the end of a hallway, stood out like a dark secret. Jen couldn't help but wonder why the room was off limits. The host had been friendly, answering all her questions about the city, but when she casually asked about the locked door, he quickly brushed her off, saying it was just for storage. But there was something in the way he said it, too quick, too rehearsed, that made Jen uneasy. Why would a place so perfect have a locked room? And why wasn't she supposed to know what was inside? Over the course of her stay, Jen's curiosity about the locked room only grew. She tried to focus on the vibrant city and the excitement of being in a new place, but the door remained a nagging thought in the back of her mind. She couldn't help but wonder what was behind it. Every time she passed, she felt an unsettling pull, like the room was calling her, drawing her in. She tried asking the host again about the room the next morning, but he quickly changed the subject, offering a quick excuse about it being an old storage space. The way he avoided her gaze made her even more suspicious. The next few nights passed quietly, but one evening, as Jen was reading in the living room, she heard something. A faint dragging sound coming from behind the locked door. At first, she thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, but as the sound grew louder, she couldn't ignore it. It was like something, or someone, was moving behind that door, shifting across the floor in a slow, deliberate manner. Jen's heart began to race. Was it just a noise? Or was someone or something really in there? The sound didn't stop, it only grew louder, more distinct, and Jen could no longer deny it. She had to know what was behind that door. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, a compulsion that tugged at her every nerve. That night, unable to ignore the increasing noise from behind the locked door, Jen gathered the courage to confront the source of her fears. She waited until the host was out for the evening, then she searched the apartment for a key. After what felt like hours, she found it hidden beneath a dusty vase, barely visible, almost like it was waiting for her. Her heart pounded as she inserted the key into the lock. The metal scraped loudly, echoing in the silence of the apartment. The door swung open slowly, and Jen stepped inside. The room was perfect, too perfect. It was pristine, as if no one had ever set foot inside it. Everything was in place, as though it had been staged for someone's first viewing. But it wasn't the room itself that caught Jen off guard. It was the mirror hanging on the far wall. She had seen it in the corner of her eye many times before, but now, with the door open, she saw it clearly. Jen took a step closer to the mirror, curiosity overcoming her fear. And that's when it happened. In the reflection, she saw someone standing behind her, someone who wasn't there. The figure was blurred, indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. It was tall, its form shadowed, its face hidden in the reflection. Jen froze, unable to move. Her blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't alone in the room. She whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but there was nothing. No one. The room was empty, but the reflection remained, and the figure in it never moved, its cold eyes staring back at her. In a panic, Jen turned around, her breath quickening, heart pounding. She stumbled backward, her hands gripping the edges of the room as she tried to steady herself. Her eyes shot to the door, but as she moved, she heard something, a sudden crash of glass. The mirror shattered before her eyes, splintering into 1,000 pieces, each one catching the light and casting shards of reflected terror around the room. Jen screamed, her voice ragged, as she fell to the floor, her back pressed against the farthest corner of the room. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. But then it hit her. This wasn't just an abandoned room. This wasn't a mistake or an old and used space. It was a trap, a room designed to keep her here, to keep her from leaving. And the mirror? It wasn't just a reflection, it was a doorway. A way for whatever was in the room to watch her, to reach out to her. Jen turned, desperate to escape, but as she ran toward the door, the lock clicked shut. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. Something, or someone, had locked it from the outside. She was trapped. Jen fled the apartment, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs aching from the frantic escape. She didn't stop to pack her things. She didn't even bother with the door. She bolted out of the apartment, into the cold night air, her mind spinning with everything she had just witnessed. She didn't care about anything else. She just needed to leave. Whatever that thing in the mirror was, whatever trap had been waiting for her, it was something she could never unsee. She left that night and didn't look back, her breath coming in quick gasps as she fled down the stairs of the building and into the street. She never returned to that Airbnb. She couldn't. She couldn't even bring herself to tell anyone exactly what had happened, not yet. The images, the feelings, the sounds, they would haunt her forever. A week later, her mind still unsettled by the ordeal, Jen decided to check the Airbnb listing again. She thought it might help her gain some closure, to see if the apartment was still available, or maybe to warn future guests. But when she searched for the listing, something strange happened. The room, the locked room, was gone. It wasn't listed in the floor plan, not even a mention of it, as if it had never existed. And the host, he was gone too. No messages, no response to her inquiries. She contacted Airbnb, but they claimed there were no records of any host by that name. The account had vanished, erased like a ghost. Jen stared at the screen, the chill creeping back into her spine. The apartment, the room, the host, it all felt like a dream, a nightmare she was still stuck in. And as she sat there, trying to make sense of everything, she realized something else. The memories of the room, the strange events, the mirror, they were becoming harder to recall. Fuzzy, like they were slipping away. But the one thing she knew for sure was this: she would never forget the feeling of being watched, the feeling that something had been waiting for her behind that locked door. Something that didn't want her to leave. 3 seemingly ordinary Airbnb stays, 3 terrifying encounters. In each case, the guests arrived expecting comfort, peace, and relaxation, only to discover that the walls they trusted were hiding far more than they could ever imagine. From the locked rooms and strange noises to the figures lurking just beyond sight, these weren't just stories. They were real, bone-chilling experiences that show you that sometimes, the scariest things don't reveal themselves until it's far too late. The truth is far more chilling than you think. Because behind the doors of every Airbnb, behind the welcoming faces and charming decor, there could be something far darker, something waiting to trap you, something lurking where you least expect it. The next time you book that perfect getaway, ask yourself, what's really behind those doors? Have you ever experienced something creepy in an Airbnb? Share your stories in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to stay updated with more true horror stories. If you've stayed somewhere that seemed too good to be true, or if you've had a spine-chilling encounter yourself, leave your story below. We love hearing from you, and want to know what you think really lies behind those locked doors. Until next time, stay safe, and always check behind the door before you lock it.